The comments and views expressed on The More Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the view of Kevin Moore, The More Show, or this radio station and its affiliate or sponsors. This show is for entertainment purposes only.
Broadcasting from Amsterdam and across the world online. You're now watching The More Show and I'm your host, Kevin Moore. For the next hour, I'll be covering subjects that will open up your mind and provide you with information you may have never heard before. Now on today's show, I'm about to be joined with my guest, Dr. William Keepin. Now William, who is a mathematical physicist and an environmental scientist, has been a practitioner on the contemplative path of divine love for over 35 years. Now, he co-founded the Satyana Institute and Gender Reconciliation International with his wife, who together conduct trainings, retreats and workshops nationally and internationally, encouraging individuals, communities and organizations to combine the inner work of the heart with the outer service in the world. William Keepin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on this show, Kevin.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Interesting book cover. I mean, the book cover grabbed us on this one, actually. And the title of this book is Belonging to God, Science, Spirituality, and a Universal Path of Divine Love. Science and spirituality, that's an interesting one. I don't get many authors that come on to combine the both. Do you think you've combined both in this book?
I think I have, yes. I think that science is basically a type of quest for knowledge, and spirituality is a quest for our true identity. And so I think there is a place where the two come together and profoundly overlap and ultimately become the same inquiry. The one ultimately requires the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And you never saw your life going down this path, did you? It was only when you was handing in your Ph.D., the actual final version, finished version, when all those years of study from bachelor's to master's to the Ph.D. and everything else that you had to go through, that you then see a spiritual textbook, in a sense, and that drew you to this path that you're on now. And isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, yes. I was literally handing in the dissertation, having finished everything, having finished the final edits after the defense, and I was filing it with the secretary, about to walk out with a brand new shiny PhD in my hand. And as the secretary went to file the thing away, on his desk there was this book. And I kind of surreptitiously picked the book up, make sure no one was looking. Actually, I was expecting to ridicule it because it was a book by Krishnamurti, and I thought, oh, this is going to be some of those, flaky Hare Krishna chanting people or something. I had this concept in my mind about what religion was. But I read to a page and I was blown away. Then I opened another page, I was blown away. And then I quickly put the book down before the guy came back and discovered that I'm going through his things. And he said, "Congratulations, Dr. Keepin." Handed me, my certificate. I was completely done with 25 years of schooling, and I basically went out immediately to the bookstore and stayed up till 3 a.m. just devouring and being infused by this book. So I do say that my spiritual training began the instant my secular training ended.
Yes. And what has been the most rewarding part for you on going down this path rather than just sticking to what you may have gone down?
Well, I would have to say the most rewarding part is the incredible majesty and mystery and expansiveness of the spiritual journey. The scientific training gave me an intellectual conception of the vastness, and when you study, quantum physics and the best of classical physics like electromagnetism and Maxwell's equations, and then come into Einstein's relativity theory and quantum physics, there's this vast expansion of one's conceptual universe. But it's pretty much all in the head. And when I began to really delve into the depths of the spiritual journey, there's something that begins to open in the heart. and there are the eyes of the heart that are opened, and one sees another kind of vastness. And the whole point of this book is really to show that these are correlated, that the vastness of the scientific vision is really a special case, in my opinion, the way I understand it, of the vastness of the spiritual reality. And of course, we know that in our Western culture, never the twain shall meet. There's been this long-standing kind of conflict in a way, or seeming tension between the scientific worldview and the spiritual worldview. And I feel that that is really misplaced. And so the purpose of this book is to really try to make a skillful union of the two, and to show that they're not mutually exclusive. This is very important.
Now, most scientists will not want to look into these subjects of spirituality or faith-based. Well, let's stick with spirituality because that's what we're really getting into here as well. They just do not want to know. As far as they're concerned, there is no data to say that life continues, and unless it's a repeatable experiment, then it's not scientific.
Yes, that is the kind of orthodox view, and there's a certain legitimacy to that view, and yet I would contend that actually there is data, and it is repeatable, and that's another reason I wrote the book. As Karl Popper said, the great famous philosopher of science, he said new paradigms entail new practices that disclose new kinds and categories of data. Now, that's a very important statement, what he's saying. New paradigms entail new practices that disclose new kinds of data. So here's the bottom line, is that doing the spiritual practice, for example, of silent meditation, if one takes that discipline seriously and engages in it for years, one is taken on an inner journey. And that inner journey reveals new paradigms and reveals new kinds of data that we might say is in the imaginal realm. Now, the traditional understanding is that's merely subjective sort of imaginings. But what we find, if we can stay consistent with that practice, and if we then compare what the contemplatives and mystics across the spiritual traditions have discovered, we find there's a very profound unity in their visions. And there's a very profound similarity in the spiritual transformational journey. That, to me, is the kind of data that we're talking about. So it's a data of a subtle psycho-spiritual kind, but it's data nonetheless. And if you look at the seriousness of which these greatest mystics took the journey, they were incredibly scientific. They were incredibly rigorous about not taking something on faith, but verifying it independently through other mystics, through independent testimony, and checking out their revelations and visions before they begin to put them out as sort of representations of truth or reality. So they are no less rigorous in that regard than the best of the quantum and relativistic physicists.
Okay. Some food for thought there, definitely. And I suppose there is a science of consciousness, but it's just in the very early stages, isn't it?
That's precisely correct, and that needs to be understood. We can't fault science for not having a science of consciousness because it simply has sidestepped the issue. Finally, that's becoming to be recognized. Now, there is a dogma out there that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon, as they call it, a side effect of brain physiology, of the neurotransmitters and the neurochemistry in the brain. And that all consciousness is produced by those neurotransmitters. This, however, is becoming increasingly untenable. It's equivalent to saying that the television program is produced by the electronics inside the TV set. And
yes,
the reason that is supposed is because if you mess with the components of the TV set, the image quality and the sound are altered. And so the naive hypothesis is that therefore the program is coming from inside the TV set. But of course, we know in the case of the TV set, that's not true. The program comes from beyond the TV set. The TV is merely a receiver that makes that programming manifest. And
So could you say then that we are picking up our consciousness as a receiver, and our consciousness is somewhere else?
That is the better conceptualization. Let's first of all acknowledge that the nature of consciousness is as yet a supreme mystery. Science certainly has not figured it out, and the spiritual traditions of the world, although they've delved deeply into it, the greatest mystics are always speaking about it with the greatest humility rather than a certitude of this is how it is. They are always saying that how it is impossible to say in words, but the best I can do is to give you this metaphor or that metaphor. So let's first of all be clear that we're talking about something that is beyond conceptualization, period. That's the first thing. It's very profound what we're speaking of. But within that framework, it is more accurate to say that consciousness is out there somewhere and then is received and transmitted through the mind brain than it is to say that consciousness is produced by the mind. And we have now, massive amounts of clinical data coming from clinicians, cardiologists across the world in the whole realm of near-death experience, where people are clinically dead and having these profound visionary experiences when the brain has a flat EKG and the heart has stopped, and there is no way that person can be having these things according to traditional medical understanding. The person is clinically dead, and yet these profound visions are happening, and sometimes the person is able to record precise details of what's going on that they could not have known any other way, except by some, perception of reality that is outside the body and the mind. And so that thesis that consciousness exists beyond the brain is now becoming more and more plausible based on the data. However, there's still massive resistance to it from what we might call the orthodoxy of mainstream materialist science. Yeah, and they say there's no evidence for it, in the same sense. Of course, that's not true now. There is evidence for it, but the kind of evidence that's demanded is a concrete proof of it. But, there was no evidence for quantum physics, 150 years ago. None whatsoever. That doesn't mean it was true.
No, that's true. That's true. Well, what are the best scientists in the field of the brain, as far as they understand? Where is consciousness being produced from their theories? Is it within the brain? That's the mainstream science still for the brain. I mean, and also, how much do brain specialists who study the brain, that's not the right word, I know, but who study the brain, really know or understand about the brain?
Well, we're talking about neuroscientists, would be kind of brain specialists. And, they are a spectrum like in any other field. There are brilliant neuroscientists who basically maintain the consciousness is produced from within the brain, and they present their data, and they certainly have plenty of data. And there are other brilliant neuroscientists who say, no, it's not that way at all. The consciousness is produced outside the brain is merely a transmitter and receiver. So it's a scientific debate that's emerging. The weight of the mainstream is still on the side of brain produces consciousness. But it's becoming much less plausible and defensible in face of the data, the near-death data, the out-of-body data, as well as some of the parapsychological data, all of which taken together are pointing towards consciousness existing beyond the brain. And what's interesting is that all of that data is also consistent with the mystical testimony across the ages and across the traditions.
That's true.
And this is what I find so compelling. So, for example, if science comes to the realization eventually that the person does not die when the body dies, that's the essence of what's emerging now. In the whole field of near-death, of out-of-body experience, and the scientific name for that field is thanatology, the study of death, that the person does not die when the body dies. If they get to that realization, which I predict will come in this century, probably in the next decade or two, as a basically accepted by the vast majority of scientists, a fact that is the required conclusion of the evidence. And when we get to that, we will have arrived where the Bhagavad Gita starts in chapter 2, when Krishna teaches that you do not die when the body dies. And that means that science will have arrived where mysticism was 2,500 years ago. So in this sense, science is 2,500 years behind mysticism on this issue. No, that's part of the problem. That's why, yes and no. But I think part of the reason that it is so resisted is because there's a refusal to want to discover it. This is a natural human tendency. The human being, we develop a set of mastery and we develop a theory of reality, and we don't really want to be shown that it's mistaken or limited. We like to think that it's a comprehensive map of reality. But as Mark Twain said so beautifully, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you think you know that ain't so. This is the fundamental problem in all areas of human inquiry, not just in science, in any intellectual discipline whatsoever, in theology and religion. It's where we basically extrapolate from what we do know and project it onto all of reality. It's a natural human tendency, a natural tendency of the mind. So that we need to kind of develop a fundamental, I would say, ontological humility here and recognize how little we know and come with a bowed head to the supreme infinite mystery of existence in the universe. And then those secrets will be revealed slowly. So to me, there's a whole attitude of inquiry that needs to happen that's changing from the traditional scientific method of, it was even called by Francis Bacon, torturing the secrets out of nature, to basically opening the heart to becoming a beloved of nature. I mean, who would you reveal your secrets to? This is something that Richard Tarnas says so beautifully. To one who comes to torture your secrets out of you, or to one who approaches you with love and humility? To whom would you reveal your deepest truths?
So true, so true. Yeah, I mean, well, who knows? I mean, yeah, potentially in this century, maybe they are understanding of consciousness being separate from the body, or even if it was proved to be within, will be proved one way or another. But I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't.
Yeah, no, I think it will eventually be essentially proven by the empirical weight of the evidence that consciousness at least is behaving very clearly as if it has a source outside the body. That is becoming a very difficult conclusion not to reach. By the way, I want to say one other thing about this whole science thing, because one of the great British scientists, Rupert Sheldrake, who wrote that beautiful book, The Science Delusion, obviously in a response to Dawkins' The God Delusion. And in that book, he basically looks at what he calls the 10 fundamental dogmas of science. The principle of materialism, the fact that consciousness exists in the brain and these kinds of things. And he basically says, well, let's look at these scientifically and see how they hold up in the face of the evidence. And he finds out not one of them holds up in the face of the evidence. So what's happened is that science has developed its own dogma that's rather similar to religious dogma. And so that's the issue that needs to be addressed. But the true science, which is the open-ended inquiry and not accepting things till they're proven, still holds. There are many brilliant scientists who see right through this dogma and are not taken in by it, particularly in the East, I have to say. I have been privileged to work extensively in India. I've met many Indian physicists in particular and Indian mathematicians who basically practice their spirituality in the mornings and the evenings, and then they do their science during the day, and they're impeccable scientists, just as good as our Western scientists. Yet they don't buy the scientific worldview as the ultimate ontological reality. They see right through its limitations, and they have no problem with the spiritual worldview being a vaster expanse than the more limited materialist scientific worldview.
Absolutely. I mean, I believe that, just going back here a little bit as well, that you first started out in psychology, but then turned to physics and mathematics. Man, I mean, I think there's a great thing about, learning science, isn't there? And combining that with spirituality. There's something special about that, because you can get, you can respect a lot of things, can't you, with science, and to see where science comes from, especially from a mathematical perspective as well. There's maths in everything, isn't there?
Absolutely. Scientific inquiry basically instills this vast wonder of the universe. And in particular, it gives a kind of outline for the structure of manifestation, and it's unparalleled in the insights that it reveals. So we're not critiquing what science has advanced. We're simply expanding it into areas where there has been this unjustified projection. So, for example, when there's an area of ignorance in science, then we develop a statistical description of that, and then we develop a statistical scientific analysis, stochastic analysis. That has its place, but we need to recognize it's rooted in the failure to be able to see more deeply the refinements. And so, as physicist David Bohm said so beautifully, a hidden order may be present in what appears to be random. And this is where what happens with science comes across a particular phenomenon in which there's no discernible order. Then we assume that there is no order in the inherent reality. And what we should assume is that maybe our instrumentation and our epistemology is not yet sophisticated enough to detect that more refined order.
With your book, what is the most important message of the book? Now, I normally ask this at the end, but I just want to get this in there now, and then we're going to get into the religious aspect of it as well. What would you say, what is the aim of the book and the most important message of it?
Well, the aim of the book is several. One is to really point out that the similarities across the world religions are far more profound and illuminating than the differences. And this is really important because we have so much emphasis on the differences and all of the religious conflicts that are constellated around cultivating the differences across the religions, the different theologies, the conflicting contradictions, across the religions. And that has a place, but it's really the details. It's a kind of racist, you could say the difference between human beings according to their skin color. There's a deeper reality of the oneness of human beings. The blood runs red in everyone. And similarly, the religious traditions have a unitive, transformative journey at their core. They all proclaim a oneness to the supreme reality, whether it's called Dharmakaya in Buddhism or the Godhead in Christianity or Brahman, Nirguna in Hinduism. The primary injunction across all the theistic traditions is to love and serve this one supreme reality. And then the mystics and contemplatives across the traditions have realized very similar descriptions of the transcendent Godhead. So, for example, if you look at some of the greatest mystics like Meister Eckhart in Christianity, Ibn Arabi in Islamic Sufism, and Shankara in Hinduism, there's a beautiful analysis done by a British scholar, Reza Shah Kazemi, who shows that their realization of God is virtually identical in terms of the qualitative phenomenology of realization, and also the ascent to that kind of union with God has the similar stages, and the transformation of consciousness that results is virtually the same. It's not to say that there aren't these differences. We celebrate the differences. This is not to dissolve the differences into some kind of vague fusion. Each of the religions is a vast sacred world unto itself. But what we're saying is that the transformative journey from ordinary consciousness into divinized consciousness is essentially, the major features of that journey are essentially identical across the religious traditions. And there is then the soul's journey is in essence one journey that one proceeds from the limited finite human identity to the transcendent infinite union with what is called God across the traditions. That to me needs to be much more emphasized than focusing on some of the theological differences across the scriptures.
How in depth did you study different scriptures?
Well, I've been, working with the Bhagavad Gita of Hinduism for decades, as well as the Gospels. I spent several years delving into the Quran and reading Sufism, and I lived in a Sufi community for a year and a half. And I focused on those three traditions primarily, although I also spent a long time with Buddhism and did many Buddhist retreats as well. But I had to limit the book to some degree, and I chose to focus on the theistic traditions, partly because there is so much anti-God rhetoric. There's so much dismissal of religion, and particularly dismissal of the concept of God or the reality of God, in the sort of new atheism that's emerging, and I felt that what's happening is we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I deliberately chose the title "Belonging to God" to basically highlight that the exquisite gift of these religions must be retained in the current climate of sort of anti-religious rhetoric. And the point of the book is to really focus, as I say, on the best and the brightest rather than the dumbest and the dimmest aspects, which seem to be the focus of sort of the new atheism. And so I'm really trying to uphold the profundity of these traditions, which call out to every human soul this journey of the heart that leads to union with the absolute infinite. And this is every soul's birthright. And this is being lost in all of this rhetoric. And that to me is very unfortunate, because I see no contradiction between the scientific worldview and the spiritual worldview whatsoever. The two are complementary aspects of one journey, and if one takes either of them profoundly seriously, I think it leads to the other. I think a scientist who's really serious about science eventually has to ask, who am I, the scientist? Who is this investigator? And if you ask that deeply and take that question in the depths of your heart, it leads you on a spiritual journey. It's unavoidable.
But obviously, with mainstream religions, obviously, there's a lot of fear in all of them. I mean, let's just look at the parts that you don't want to look at, or this book doesn't look at as well. What about the fear-based parts of all the religions? Hell, being gay, not conforming to a set religion, and all other religions are false, and this is the only truth. I mean, these are real life issues with these religions, aren't they?
They are, and I affirm the reality of all of these problems. I don't deny any of them. And you're right, you've named several of them. I think the exclusivity is one of the big problems. The homophobia is one of the big problems. The justification of violence is one of the big problems. The inequality between men and women and masculine and feminine is one of the big problems. What I say in the book is that these are very important issues. I don't deny any of them, and there's plenty of material available. And I cite a few of what I think are some of the best references. For example, there's a beautiful book called When Religion Goes Astray by Don McKenzie, Imam Jamal Rahman, and Ted Falcon, and basically Rabbi Ted Falcon. And they basically go into the shadow side of each of these traditions of the Abrahamic faith. And they don't mince words. They go right into this. So, and acknowledge the limitations and the dogmas and the failings. What therefore seems important to me, given that there's so much focus on the shadow side of religions, that's why I say it's the dumbest and the dimmest parts of them, and it's there in Christianity too. I mean, so what's therefore important is to then look at what is the beauty of these traditions. What is their ultimate purpose? The ultimate purpose of Christianity is transformation into Christ, nothing else. This is a quotation from Father Thomas Keating, the great contemplative monk of Christianity, who's been a monk for 70 years. That basically we are called to go through a transformation in which we become Christed. As St. Paul said, I live yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. The same could be said of Buddhism. I live yet not I, but Buddha liveth in me. That is the purpose of Buddhism, is to be transformed into a Buddha. The same is the case in Vaishnavite Hinduism, to be transformed into a Krishna. This is the great gift and calling of these traditions, and they deliver if one gives oneself fully to the practices and the discipline.
Can you find God without religion?
I think you can. And I think that because God is bigger than any one religion, and realization of God is the birthright of every human soul, the religions were created as vehicles to support the realization of God, but they're not the only pathway. However, it should be said that to seek to find God without any guidance whatsoever is kind of equivalent to climbing Mount Everest with no guide, no preparation, just putting your backpack, getting your water bottles, and just heading up the trail to go to the top of Everest. it's not likely to succeed, but it's possible. And there will be traditions that will develop mystical pathways that will develop outside of the traditional religions. And there is, I think that's something we will see, is the emergence of legitimate spiritual pathways with spiritual mentors that are manifesting beyond and outside of the religious traditions. So that is something that is certainly possible. And I think will probably become more prominent over the next, few decades.
But with religion, I find that you're very controlled into thinking a set way, and any diversion from that, you are not embracing the set religion then. And just personally, I mean, and there's others like me that just wouldn't want that sort of control on their thoughts and the way they act. And sometimes the reality or the conclusion of reality that people like myself come to is greater than the truth in just one book.
Yes. Well, that is, I think, a phenomenon. I don't doubt what you're saying. I mean, I don't deny what you're saying. That same phenomenon is found in science, for example. We find many scientists who have a very limited view and hold that view as the way that one must think, and that there's no other way to think. So it's really a product of the limitations of the human mind, it seems to me, that's not limited to religion, but it's being strongly projected onto religion. And for good reason, because there has been, in a certain sense, I think, a profound failure of the churches and many religious institutions that have actually betrayed the true spirit of the tradition and replaced it with a dogmatic set of rules and formulas that one must conform to. I mean, this is what Jesus was complaining about with the Pharisees when he basically chastised them for not entering the kingdom of heaven and not allowing others to enter. So he was basically calling this very problem, 2,000 years ago within the Christian tradition. The Buddha, the same thing with the Brahmanic priests who'd become sort of just given to these empty rituals. And the true spirit of the whole tradition was being betrayed in the name of upholding it. So we do have this problem in religion, and many of the churches are simply replicating this same sort of process of betraying the soul's journey in the name of Scripture and in the name of religion. So it's incumbent on the true seeker to look for where is the depth of this tradition, what is the deeper truth here that we are called to, and to find those masters who are actually, representing that and teaching that and training that, and find them in every religion if one is serious and seeks them out. And I would say in every case, they are people who have transcended sort of the letter of the Scripture and are true to the spirit of the Scripture. As St. Paul said, we must be true to the spirit and not the letter. This is a very profound need, really, in any area of inquiry, not just in religion.
And then, maybe then you're allowed to add some of your own truths to such religions. I mean, would I be kicked out of the church for wanting to add my own truths to set text? Would that be allowed?
Well, I think that the greatest of the mystics, when they write their writings that are basically inspired revelations, they are essentially writing new Scripture, in effect. So yes, they are adding their own truths. Generally, what I would say is those truths are new articulations of that one supreme truth coming in a new particular ray of divine light. That's how I would understand it. But those particular rays are profound and new and fresh. I mean, we see it with, for example, the poetry of Rumi. Who hasn't been inspired by Rumi? We all have. And yet Rumi says very explicitly that his entire revelation is based entirely on the Quran and the Hadith. And he says anyone who denies that, he says, I repudiate that person. So anyone who's been inspired by Rumi has been inspired by the sacred wisdom of Islam. And those direct correlations between everything Rumi said and wrote with the Quran and the mystical wisdom of Islam are there. It's entirely a re-expression. In fact, in Persian, they call Rumi's Mathnawi the Persian Quran. They basically venerate it so highly that they see it as the Quran rewritten in Persian through Rumi's revelation. So he, in one sense, added nothing new, and in another sense, it's entirely new. He basically gave a whole new, fresh articulation of these profound and ancient truths. And I think that's true of all the great mystics, the greatest mystics. And each one of us can have an experience of that revelatory consciousness if we come into that depth of union with the kernel of the tradition rather than the outer shell. The shell is where you get all the conflicting theologies, the outer husk of it all. But when you get
but some scholars in those religions, let's keep to Islam just right now, will back those up to their death. In that sense.
Yes, they will.
And I don't mean to kill someone. I just mean until their last passing breath, they will back the shell structure up, and that's it. And they attract very large numbers.
That's very true. That's also true. That's true in all the religions. And in many ways, it's very true in science as well. We see whole schools of scientific thinking that are really held within a particular framework that is ultimately, frequently very dogmatic. And actually, many of those, for example, in Rupert Sheldrake's book, The Science Delusion, those 10 dogmas are taken by many scientists to have been proven. They assume that these tenets, like, for example, that material reality is the only thing that exists, has long since been proven by science. They don't realize that these are free, assumptions that have never been proven, and when put against the evidence, don't hold up. So there's been a rather unscientific spirit of scientific dogma in the same way that there's an sort of spiritual spirit of religious dogma. The process is really very similar. And I don't mean to be overly critical of science, but I'm saying if we're going to be that critical of religion, let's look at how that same process happens in science as well. And you could even criticize science. For example, you could say the way that Islam is dismissed, for example, you quote one or two lines of scripture that are very problematic, and then you look at, some of the heinous things that have been done, and you dismiss the entire religion as a religion of evil. You do the same thing with Christianity. You can take the quotation from the Gospels where Jesus says, "I have not come to bring peace but a sword," to sow discord in the family. And then you look at the various ways that the Christian nations have sowed all kinds of discord, whether it's the Holocaust or the Crusades or apartheid. And then you dismiss the entire religion as evil. And it's quite doable, especially if you know nothing about Christianity. And most of us know nothing about Islam. So we're very gullible to a very simplistic dismissal. And you could do the same thing with science. You could say, well, look, we've got, quantum physics, physics gave us, nuclear weapons, the hydrogen bomb. And chemistry gave us the gas chamber. And, biology gave us anthrax and germ warfare. Therefore, and those things have killed millions or hundreds of thousands at least. And therefore, science is inherently evil, so you throw the whole thing out. It's that trivial.
No, it's so true what you're saying. It's so true. Do you think, would you advise those seekers trying to align with your work, or that do align with your work, that reading the scriptures of these different religions is of great benefit, and many people have read these, read the religious texts of Christianity and Islam and others. But do you think that's do you think you can get lost in it sometimes, lost in the dogma, or do you think
Absolutely.
Yeah?
It's incredibly valuable to read scripture, but you need to do it with guidance. If you just open, most scriptures at the beginning and try to go from A to Z, it's not advisable. My Muslim friends, like Imam Jamal Rahman, who's written a beautiful book called The Spiritual Gems of Islam, a book like that is where I would start. I would not start by going out and buying a copy of the Quran and trying to read it. It's so dense. There's so many categories, ontological and cultural, that one has to understand to even understand what it's saying. It's so full of allegory and myth and story, and the whole thing is not organized in a way that would make sense to a Westerner.
Yeah.
And Same, and I would say the same is true with the scriptures. One that's a little easier to just pick up and read is the Bhagavad Gita. First of all, it's 10 times shorter than either the Quran or the New Testament. But secondly, it's more laid out scientifically, as Gandhi said. What Jesus puts out in rhetorical form in the Sermon on the Mount is laid out in scientific form in the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
But even there, you need a guide. Otherwise, these categories, these Hindu terms and phrases that you don't know, throw you off and you get nowhere. So to read scripture, especially these ancient scriptures properly, you need certain guidance. And I refer in my book to several of what I think are the best simple guides to support an earnest person to help read the scripture with wisdom. But I also think it's very important to read the best of the mystics in the traditions, because they are the ones who translate it into practical life experience. And they are the ones who show how it translates into a lived experience of divine love in their everyday life and in their associations with family and friends, the challenges they encounter. Then the whole tradition comes alive and you begin to see, yes, this really is a fire of divine love and wisdom that burns in the heart, and you're able to see how it works in practice. So I think it's very important to read scriptures and mystics together.
But then obviously the extremists that are being cleared out of Iraq right now and other places, they've hijacked the religion. Quick yes or no? Yeah, okay. So yes, you say yes.
They definitely hijacked it. They are absolutely abusing it. And actually, let's take in the case of the Muslim extremists, because there's so much focus on them. They basically hate the normal peace-loving Muslims. And if we are foolish enough to fall into their kind of rejecting the ordinary peace-loving Muslims, we're playing right into their hands. Because they're a very small minority.
They'd be called not true Muslims.
That's absolutely right. They're not true Muslims. That's correct. And so if we fall into sort of that rejection of Muslims and Muslim philosophy and the whole religion, we're playing right into their hands. And what we need to do is really embrace the deep. If Muslim was a religion of all this evil, it's done a terrible job because it's lived mostly peaceably with other religions, for 1,400 years. The incidents of violence are
What is the difference between spirituality and religion then? Because to me, spirituality tells you what to do and what to think. Religion does that, but then spirituality, you can come up with your own ideas, and there's no one to tell you what to do or what to think. The principles are all still there, like from the main religions and spirituality of love and coming from love. So I'm not talking, going out and hurting anyone knowingly. I'm just saying that in essence, or in the bigger picture, isn't one controlling and the other is allowing you to have the free will? And isn't it also the case that most people want to be told what to think, what to do, and what to say? Because they don't want to take self-responsibility.
Well, yes, it's partly because of the latter, that people often do want to be told what to think, what to do, and what to say, that they can easily fall into a kind of dogmatic religious framework, and it's very subtle, because if we want to take up the spiritual journey, we do need guidance and practices, and so to some degree we do need to be told what to do anyway. What are the practices that we should do? And then as we practice them, we need to understand how to think about what we're doing. We need some of that basic knowledge in any area of human endeavor. It's true that religion in its institutionalization can become very controlling and actually prescriptive, and it's ironic because in the early stages of spiritual practice, there's a value in that, that one develops a certain discipline. One has to replace certain ideas with higher ideas, higher ways of thinking, if you will. But what happens when one takes the true journey, in my understanding, is that one develops an inner consciousness of light that is implanted in the heart and grows, and actually becomes a freeing of one's mental conceptualizations, and becomes a liberating spirit that is increasingly grown in the heart of the seeker. There's a beautiful description of the process by St. John of the Cross, one of the great Christian mystics. And he says, The process is impossible to describe, but it's all summarized in one statement. And then first of all, he says you can't describe it, and then he goes ahead and describes it. And what he says is the soul becomes God from God by participation in God and in God's divine attributes. And so what he's saying is that basically the soul, the human soul, becomes God. It's a very remarkable statement. The soul is transformed into God by participation in God's divine attributes. And that process, in my understanding, can be done outside of religion. It's a direct vertical relationship between every human soul and the absolute, infinite, supreme reality, which we call God. Or we could call it Dharmakaya. We don't have to call it God. Or we could call it the Tao that cannot be named. But every human being has a direct connection with that. And as we give ourselves to that, what happens is that replaces us. We are transformed into that. And so in that sense, there is a kind of dissolving of our human identity as a limited, separate self, and a replacement of it with an infinite identity of the infinite supreme reality that we discover lives in the depths of us. So we are that supreme reality.
And for those who are not very keen on the word God, is there just one word you could replace God with?
I would replace it with probably ultimate reality. It's not very satisfying, but it's an accurate description. There is an ultimate supreme principle of existence. We might call it life with a capital L because it is a living reality, but it is, that one source. You could also replace it with the word source with a capital S, the actual origin and source of all that exists. There is some supreme mystery. I mean, none of us created ourselves, right? We got here somehow. Whatever it was that made all this happen, give it a name. Call it the source. That source is in each of us. It is the deepest secret in the depths of our heart, is that same source. And so what we discover when we go into the depths of our beings is that we are that very source, which we call in the different traditions ultimate reality, or God, or Dharmakaya. In Buddhism, it's called Dharmakaya. A lot of people don't have resistance to Dharmakaya. But actually, as certain scholars have shown, the ultimate reality affirmed by Buddhism is none other than what monotheists call the essence of God. There's a term homeomorphic equivalence. Homeomorphic equivalence, a term coined by Panikar, the great interspiritual scholar, Raimundo Panikar. And he basically says the religions have these homeomorphic equivalents, that these concepts of Dharmakaya and the absolute Godhead and Brahman Nirguna, they're actually all names for the same one supreme reality. Just like water, Wasser, and aqua are different names in different languages for that same mysterious substance of life that we drink every day.
Now, your book, thank you for that, by the way. Now, your book is all about, to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, is all about bringing or bridging the gap between all the religions, the common, beautiful threads between them all, the most healing threads between them all.
That's part of it. And then the other part of it is to articulate how that's possible by drawing on some of the greatest advancements of science.
Yes.
To illustrate how it all hangs together.
Now that's a really profound thing that you've done. That's why when I saw who was coming on today, I was like, isn't that something I always say, that if the world's religions could have a commonality, some common thread between them, that they actually wanted to get on, the world could change overnight.
Well, thank you. That is correct. I think that's a very important possibility. And part of the inspiration for writing this book comes from one of my mentors, Thomas Keating, who was a Catholic monk, but who for 33 years convened a group of religious leaders from across all of the major religions. And the particular ones that he brought were the contemplatives and the mystics. And what they found over their inquiry, over these 3 decades, was they found that there were certain common principles common to all those traditions. they were thrilled to find this common ground. And my book is basically articulating that common ground. But then what they found, and this is really important, they then very cautiously began to explore their differences. And they were concerned because they thought, oh dear, we've got this beautiful common ground. And now as we go into our differences, we may become, struggling and conflicted and all of that. And instead, what they found was just the opposite. They found that they bonded even more over their differences than their common ground, because they saw the differences as an endless and fascinating inquiry, and they were delighted by the richness of the diversity in the frame of the common ground. So what those religious leaders have done, those 60 religious leaders from across the traditions have done, is essentially what now needs to happen in the larger human family. They have achieved that unity of the spiritual journey within the diversity of the religious traditions. And that's what we
Yes,
now need to do on a large scale.
yes, that is true. But then there's so many other followers of the religions out there that do not come from the space that we're discussing right now, will never come across this interview, will always be around people who are indoctrinated to differences and anger and fear and hate. And when you see the flood of refugees coming into Europe right now from Syria, and even in Islam itself, there's different factors of Islam. And in those different factors, there's that much difference between the belief of one type of Islam to another. And that difference is enough for them to kill each other. And they come over to
Absolutely.
countries like ours, I'm based in Amsterdam, and I want them to come over here. But the difference is, the cultural differences are not that big anymore. It's between two different Islamic religions. It's beyond. It's huge, and they're not. It's kind of scary in one sense, because they're not going to adopt to our ways of living. We have to adopt to theirs. And this is replicated in America as well, where there's lots of this going on in different parts of the world. So, as much as me and you right now can speak as sensibly and as calmly and as try to come to the, we're both wanting to come from the same space, me and you. There's many out there that are unable to.
Well, I make no claim to have the answers for this huge dilemma. And thank you for articulating it. There's no question that what you speak of is true. What I'm saying are two things. One, that there is a very credible vision and reality of the fundamental unity of all the religions, which is vastly underemphasized, and in my view needs to be much more emphasized by those who have realized this unity. And that is emerging across what I would say the sort of more, in my opinion, the more advanced practitioners across the religions are realizing this unity and articulating it more strongly every day. That is an important movement that is taking place, and it is definitely a counter and a healing balm to the very issues that you speak of. The second thing I want to say is that much of this conflict is actually politically motivated, and religion is used as an excuse simply because it's a convenient framework to hang the conflict on, and it's actually a misappropriation. So I think that religion is often used as the excuse. I think, for example, what we saw in Germany in the 30s, the Jews had lived peaceably alongside Christians for a long time. Yes, there were maybe tensions here, but there was a deliberate cultivation of scapegoating of Jews, that suddenly Judaism emerged in the 30s in Germany as the source of all its evils, which was just a complete lie. But it was very convenient framework to hang it on. I think we're seeing a very similar thing with Islam right now, and I think it's profoundly tragic. It doesn't deny the reality that we have certain Islamic extremists, but to taint the entire tradition, which we see even intelligent scholars doing this, to me is really unconscionable, because it's just simply not the case if you study the tradition. And what I found is that very few people have studied the tradition. I myself have found, I don't make any claim to be an expert in Islam, but I've delved into it for enough years. And I know that in my conviction, I've discovered the essence of the tradition. And it's not different from the essence of Christianity, the essence of Judaism, the essence of all the great traditions.
I think it's such an important topic, this is. And I think your solution of bringing those type of people together to have those roundtable discussions is so important. It really is. And to see the unity in such a discussion as well, for other people to see that. That's what we need more of. And one day
I've also heard there are projects. Yeah, and I've heard there are projects. There's a project in the Middle East to bring Jewish rabbis and Palestinian imams together. And the most advanced of them, they come together. I've heard this is how the meetings go. They come together. They spend for a 2-hour meeting, they spend the first hour and 45 minutes talking about the beauties of the Quran and the beauties of the Torah, and sharing with each other the beauties, and they find all these commonalities, and then they spend the last 15 minutes sketching out the solutions to the issues. They don't have a problem. The most advanced of the imams and the Jewish rabbis both understand what needs to be done. It's not really a religious conflict. It's really a political conflict. And it gets constellated in religious terms because it's a very convenient framework.
But we can't just think that we are stuck with no solution just because there's something outside of us that's in control. Maybe the solution to it is when these people come together, is to see the unity and love. And that's the only power that we have got. Yes.
It's the only power that will work. As the Buddha said so beautifully, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone. This is an ancient and universal law. It has never been violated. It never will be. Conflict will eventually be resolved by love and love alone. And how many people have to die before that happens is unknown. I don't mean to sound simplistic.
No.
This is very, very profound.
No.
But love has the power. Love has the power to heal. This is what Martin Luther King and Gandhi understood so beautifully. And as Martin Luther King said, that if we do not balance, this is a direct quote, if we do not balance our pessimism about human nature with an optimism about divine nature, we will overlook the cure of grace. The cure of grace is sort of a Christian term, but it's the power of divine love to act in the world. And that is why I wrote this book, because it's really the power of divine love that will heal these things eventually. And it's so easy to get focused totally on the pessimism of human nature and all of the evils. And I don't deny any of them. But there is something more profound that will eventually prevail. And that is the power of love to act through the human soul. The human spirit is greater ultimately than all of these political conflicted divisions.
Absolutely. And that's why, I know I've been a bit pessimistic in some of my views on here, but I wanted to cover that, the actual reality, no denial of it, the actual reality, and then bring it to this conclusion here that actually there is an answer. There actually is an answer. Some people don't care enough about the answer. That's okay. We do. I think deep down everyone does. They just don't know really what to do about it. I'm saying that the answer is within you. Just how much have you loved today, and how much have you loved to yourself, and how much has that blossomed out to other people? That's the only power that we have. And one day,
I think when I
launch a news network, which that's my future goal, I will have these roundtable discussions on the news channel with leaders such as you've spoken about, to have these conversations and to bring it back to what we're trying to conclude this on now.
Very important. We need that news. We need that good news from people who see deeply and who are actually acting from that place of love to bridge those divisions, because the heart can cross the chasms that the mind creates. And this is the spiritual solution to the human dilemma.
Absolutely, and I hope when I do launch this network that I can get you on with the round table as well. I will not forget you, don't worry.
It's wonderful. We are convening these kinds of conversations and continuing in that lineage that Thomas Keating founded, because it's so important, as you said.
No, it really is, and I really respect you for what you yourself and your wife are doing as well. And I know we've not mentioned her much here, but I do know about her contribution as well to the support.
She is a very profound contributor, and we are basically implementing a work of gender reconciliation, healing across the gender divisions in the human family, as well as these religious divisions.
And what an amazing time we live in right now! It's pretty special. It's pretty incredible, actually.
It is.
Yeah.
And in a way, one way to see this is that these divisions are coming up to be finally healed. Like we're seeing currently in the United States election campaign, all of these gender politics that have been under the surface and been denied for so long. There are now millions of conversations all across the United States about sexual violation that have been precipitated by some of the comments from our Republican nominee. And that's a good thing, even though it seems awful.
No, it's
actually the alchemy of healing is starting to happen, because these unacknowledged dynamics are beginning to surface, and they're coming up to be healed. As Martin Luther King said so beautifully, and this applies equally in the gender arena as well as in the religious arena, he said, corruption and injustice will never be transformed by keeping them hidden, but only by bringing them out into the light and transforming them with the power of love. That is the true calling of spirituality, the spiritual journey. And that's the true calling of the spiritual masters of the religions.
So true. So true. Your website.
Yes, www.pathofdivinelove.org.
Okay, wonderful.
That's really the website for my book and what we're developing. And then the other website is www.grworld.org. And that's for the gender reconciliation work that we do. And then there's a third website, www.satyana.org. That's SATYANA.org.
Okay. Well, throughout this interview, you'd be glad to know that those three websites have been coming up on the screen, along with your book as well. And people can contact you from any of those websites?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So many other questions, and that we've not included on this, and I'm sorry for not doing that.
No problem.
I think it's gone the way it was supposed to go, to be honest with you. I've really enjoyed having you on. Sorry if it was a bit tough just at some points, but
No, I
please
appreciate bring in if you have a moment. Part of the contribution, the scientific part of this book, gives an articulation of how it's possible that the human heart can contain the infinity of God. Because at first blush, that seems completely ridiculous. The human being is a little speck, 6 feet tall, and the cosmos is, 14 billion light years wide. How is it possible the human being can contain the infinity of cosmic consciousness? But actually what we learn from fractal mathematics is, in fact, that the universe is structured like a set of Russian dolls, if you will. You know how Russian dolls, you take the big one apart and inside is a littler one, and inside that's a littler one? But the little tiny one inside has the exact same structure as the original. So what we find is that the macrocosmic structure of the entire universe is replicated in the human being, and that the infinity of consciousness, which we call God, if you will, is replicated in the depths of the heart of the human being. And therefore, it is accurate, as the mystics say, that God, the full infinity of God, is contained in the depths of the human heart, and that the inmost essence of the human being is identical with the transcendent essence of that supreme reality called God. That is profound, and this whole structure of fractal geometry from mathematics, which has just been discovered in the last 20 to 30 years, shows how that works. And I spell that out in some depth in my book.
Well, I'd just like to say, Dr. William Keepin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a joy to be on your show, and I really support your new news network and getting those dialogues going, as you said. I'd be happy to help you just in any way I can, because it's so important, as you said. So blessings on your mission.
Thank you.
And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. All right.
Well, we've come to an end on tonight's show. Don't forget that you can listen and watch all our past interviews on the More Show's official YouTube channel. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new daily shows. You may also find out more on all past and upcoming guests on the show via themoreshow.com, and do like us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates. So until next time, be safe.